Back in late 2019, there was a story that emerged from Seoul, South Korea, that would leave an entire university campus questioning what they thought they knew about shared living spaces. This unsettling account came from a 22-year-old student named Minho who thought he was simply solving his housing crisis for his final semester. But instead, he walked into something far more sinister than he could have ever imagined. Tonight, I've pieced together this experience from multiple sources to share with you all, so let's dim the lights, settle in, and uncover what really happened during Minho's last months at university. Minho was like most college seniors in Seoul, stressed about money, exhausted from years of studying, and desperately trying to make it through his final semester without completely draining his family's savings. His engineering program at one of Seoul's top universities was demanding enough without having to worry about rent, but that's exactly the position he found himself in during the winter break of 2019. His previous housing arrangement had fallen through when his roommate suddenly transferred schools, leaving Minho scrambling to find something affordable. The cost of living near campus was brutal, especially for a student whose part-time job at a convenience store barely covered his basic expenses. Every decent place he looked at was either way beyond his budget or already taken by other students who had planned ahead better than he had after 2 weeks of searching through cramped studio apartments that cost more than his monthly income. Minho was getting desperate. His parents had already stretched their finances to help with tuition, and he couldn't bring himself to ask them for more money. The stress was keeping him awake at night, scrolling through rental websites and student housing forums until his eyes burned from staring at his phone screen. He needed to find something soon, or he'd have to consider dropping out for a semester to work full-time. That's when he stumbled across a posting on a university housing board that seemed almost too good to be true. A 2-bedroom apartment just 15 minutes from campus, split rent that would cut his housing costs in half. The post was simple and straightforward, looking for a clean, quiet roommate to share a furnished apartment near the university. The rent was exactly what Minho could afford, and the location was perfect. The person who posted it went by the name Jisoo, and from their brief messages back and forth, they seemed like the ideal roommate. They were also a student, they kept regular hours, and they preferred someone who would respect their privacy and study schedule. It was exactly what Minho was looking for, someone who wouldn't interfere with his intense final semester workload. When Minho asked to see the apartment, Jisoo suggested he could just move in directly, since they were often busy with their own studies, and the previous roommate had already moved out. They sent him the address and said they'd leave the key in a lockbox by the door, with instructions on which room would be his. It was an unusual arrangement, but not unheard of among busy students. The building itself was older, but well-maintained, a typical mid-rise apartment complex that housed mostly students and young professionals. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean, and the neighborhood felt safe. Walking up to the 4th floor, Minho found apartment 4B exactly as described. The lockbox was there with the key inside and a note with his name on it. Inside, the apartment was modest but comfortable. The living room had a small sofa and coffee table. The kitchen was compact but functional, and there were 2 bedrooms down a short hallway. One door was closed with a small nameplate that read Jisoo, while the other was open, revealing an empty room with a bed, desk, and dresser already furnished. The whole place felt lived in but tidy. Minho moved his belongings in that same day, which wasn't much, just clothes. Textbooks, his laptop, and a few personal items. He'd been living pretty minimally for the past few years, focusing all his energy and resources on finishing his degree. The room was perfect for what he needed: quiet space to study and close enough to campus that he could walk to his early morning classes. For the first week, everything felt normal. Minho would leave early for classes and return in the evenings to study. He'd hear occasional sounds from Jisoo's room, the soft murmur of what sounded like studying, maybe typing or pages turning. It was exactly the kind of respectful roommate situation he'd hoped for. They both seemed to keep similar schedules, and neither disturbed the other. Minho's daily routine quickly settled into a pattern. Wake up at 6:30, shower, quickly grab coffee and a piece of toast. then walked to campus for his first class at 8. The winter air was bitter, but the walk helped him wake up fully, and he enjoyed having those quiet 15 minutes to mentally prepare for the day ahead. His final semester was packed with advanced engineering courses, senior project work, and the constant pressure of job interviews with major companies in Seoul. The competition was fierce, and Minho felt the weight of 4 years of study, all leading to this final push. Every assignment, every exam, every project presentation felt crucial to his future. In the evenings, he'd return home usually around 7 or 8, depending on whether he'd stayed late in the library or attended study groups. The apartment was always quiet when he got back, with just the faint sounds of what he assumed was Jisoo studying in their room. Occasionally, he'd hear the soft click of a door or the gentle sound of footsteps, but nothing that seemed unusual for someone trying to maintain a quiet study environment. Minho appreciated that Jisoo seemed to respect the same boundaries he preferred. They both paid their share of utilities, on time left notes about any shared expenses, and kept the common areas clean without needing to coordinate extensively. It was the kind of low-maintenance living situation that allowed him to focus entirely on his studies, without the drama or complications he'd heard about from friends with more social roommates. The shared refrigerator had a few basic items that seemed to belong to Jisoo, mostly simple foods like rice, instant noodles, and some vegetables. Minho added his own supplies, and they seemed to coexist peacefully in the small space, neither taking up too much room or interfering with the other's food storage. By the 3rd week, Minho had settled into what felt like the perfect living arrangement. His stress levels about housing had completely disappeared, allowing him to channel all his energy into his coursework. He was making good progress on his senior project, and even felt confident about some upcoming job interviews. The apartment had become a sanctuary where he could study in peace. But it was during that 3rd week that Minho first noticed something that would later seem significant, though at the time it barely registered. As unusual, he realized he had never actually seen Jisoo face to face, not when moving in, not passing in the hallway, not even briefly in the kitchen or living room. At first, this didn't strike him as particularly odd. They were both busy students with packed schedules, and it wasn't uncommon for roommates to have completely different routines that rarely overlapped. Minho was often gone from early morning until late evening, and perhaps Jisoo had an equally demanding schedule that kept them out during different hours. But as days turned into weeks, Minho started paying closer attention to the small details that had previously escaped his notice. The sounds he heard from Jisoo's room were always the same soft, consistent noises that could have been studying or typing, but never varied in rhythm or intensity. There was no music, no phone conversations, no sounds of someone moving around or rearranging furniture. The items in the refrigerator never seemed to change, either the same container of rice, the same packages of instant noodles sitting in exactly the same positions week after week. Minho began to wonder if Jisoo was eating at all, or perhaps getting all their meals elsewhere, though that seemed expensive for a student living in shared housing. One evening, while studying at his desk, Minho heard what sounded like footsteps in the hallway between their rooms. He paused his work and listened carefully. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, moving from what seemed like Jisoo's room toward the bathroom, then back again. After a few minutes, the pattern repeated several times. Always the same pace, always the same route. Curious about his elusive roommate, Minho decided to try a simple test. The next morning, he left a note on the kitchen counter asking if Jisoo wanted to split the cost of some shared groceries when he returned that evening. The note was gone, but there was no response, no reply note, no message left anywhere in the apartment. This started a pattern of small attempts at communication. Minho would leave notes about utility bills, about apartment maintenance, about sharing household supplies. Each note would disappear within a day or two, but never with any response. It was as if they were being removed, but not actually read or acknowledged by someone who wanted to communicate back. The mystery of his invisible roommate began to occupy more of Minho's thoughts than he cared to admit. He found himself listening more carefully to the sounds from the other room, trying to identify what exactly Jisoo was doing in there. The noises were so consistent, so unchanging, that they almost seemed mechanical, like a recording played on repeat. During his 4th week in the apartment, Minho experienced his first moment of genuine unease. He had returned home earlier than usual, around 5 in the afternoon, due to a cancelled class. The apartment was quiet as always, but as he settled at his desk to study, he heard those familiar footsteps in the hallway. But this time something was different. The footsteps seemed to pause directly outside his door for several minutes, not moving toward the bathroom or back to the other room. Just standing there in the hallway, Minho held his breath, listening intently, his heart rate picking up slightly as he wondered what Jisoo was doing just standing there. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps resumed their usual pattern, moving back toward the other room, but the incident left Minho feeling unsettled. For the first time since moving in, he began to question whether his roommate's situation was as ideal as he'd initially thought. The next few days brought more small irregularities that individually seemed insignificant, but together created a growing sense of something being not quite right. The apartment's temperature seemed to fluctuate in strange ways, sometimes becoming unexpectedly cold in the evenings, even when the heating system was running normally. Minho also noticed that certain items in the common areas would be moved slightly from where he'd left them. Nothing dramatic. Just small shifts that suggested someone else was using the space, but never when he was around to see it. A coffee mug moved from one side of the sink to the other, books on the coffee table rearranged in a different order. The timing of these changes was particularly puzzling because Minho was developing a more careful awareness of his surroundings. He would make mental notes of exactly how he left things and return to find them subtly altered. It was as if Jisoo was active in the apartment, but only during the precise windows when Minho was away. His studies began to suffer as the mystery consumed more of his mental energy. He found himself distracted during lectures thinking about what might be happening in the apartment while he was gone. His senior project deadlines were approaching, and he needed to focus, but the strange living situation was becoming impossible to ignore. One evening, while trying to concentrate on a particularly challenging engineering problem, Minho heard something that made him stop cold.
Minho.
It was the sound of his own name being called softly from somewhere in the apartment, not from Jisoo's room, but from the living room area, as if someone was looking for him. Minho sat frozen at his desk, uncertain whether he had actually heard his name, or if his imagination was playing tricks on him. The stress of his final semester, combined with the mystery of his roommate, was starting to affect his perception of reality. He waited several minutes, but heard nothing more. The incident with his name being called marked a turning point in Minho's experience. What had been merely puzzling was now becoming genuinely disturbing. He began to feel like he was being watched, even when he was alone in his room, an uncomfortable sensation that made it difficult to relax or focus on his studies. His sleep patterns started to deteriorate as well. He would lie awake at night, listening to the sounds from the other room, which continued with their mechanical regularity. Even in the early hours of the morning, sometimes he would hear what sounded like movement in the kitchen or living room, but when he got up to investigate, everything would be silent and still. The financial pressure that had driven him to this housing arrangement in the first place now felt secondary to his growing concern about his living situation. But with only 2 months left in his final semester and job interviews scheduled, he couldn't afford to disrupt his life by moving again. Minho tried to rationalize his concerns, telling himself that everyone has different habits and schedules. Perhaps Jisoo was just an extremely private person who preferred to avoid social interaction. Maybe they had social anxiety or were dealing with their own stress about school and preferred to keep to themselves. But deep down, Minho knew that something was fundamentally wrong with his living situation. The pieces didn't add up, and his instincts were telling him that he needed to find out the truth about who or what was sharing his apartment before his final semester came to an end. The breaking point came on a Thursday night during his 6th week in the apartment. Minho had been struggling with a particularly difficult assignment, working late into the evening when he heard something that changed everything. It wasn't the usual mechanical footsteps or the familiar sounds he'd grown accustomed to. This time, he heard the front door open and close. Minho's heart stopped. In all his weeks living there, he had never heard the front door open when he was home. He sat perfectly still at his desk, listening intently as footsteps moved through the living room. These weren't the soft, repetitive sounds he'd heard before. These were different, heavier, more deliberate. The footsteps moved toward the kitchen, and Minho heard the refrigerator door open. Then came the sound of someone moving around, preparing what sounded like a meal. For the first time since moving in, Minho was hearing his roommate actually living in the apartment, but something felt wrong. The sounds were too loud, too pronounced, like someone was making an effort to be heard. After 30 minutes of normal household noises, everything went silent again. Minho waited, barely breathing, but heard nothing more. The next morning, Minho made a decision that would haunt him forever. He was going to find out the truth about Jisoo. He couldn't continue living in this strange limbo, especially with his final exams approaching and job interviews that could determine his entire future. When he was certain the apartment was empty, Minho approached Jisoo's door. He knocked softly, then louder. No response. He tried the handle, expecting it to be locked, but it turned easily. The door swung open with a soft creak. What Minho saw inside made his blood run cold. The room was empty, not just unoccupied, but completely empty. No furniture, no personal belongings, no signs that anyone had ever lived there. Dust covered the floor in thick layers, and the air smelled stale and unused. But that wasn't the worst part. On the far wall, written in what looked like dried blood, were the words, "Why did you leave me alone?" The handwriting was shaky, desperate, and it covered nearly the entire wall in repetitive phrases. "Come back, don't leave, I'm still here," written over and over again. Minho stumbled backward, his mind reeling. If Jisoo's room was empty, then who had been making those sounds? Who had been moving his things? Who had called his name? With trembling hands, he pulled out his phone and called the building management. When they answered, Minho could barely get the words out. "I need to know about my roommate in apartment 4B, Jisoo. When did they move out?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Sir, there's no one named Jisoo registered for that apartment. According to our records, you're the only tenant listed there." "That's impossible," Minho whispered. "I've been paying split rent. Someone has been living here." "Sir, I'm looking at the records right now. The previous tenant was a student named Park Jisoo, but they passed away in that apartment 3 years ago. The room has been empty ever since. We've been having trouble renting it out." The phone slipped from Minho's hand, clattering to the floor. 3 years ago. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had been living with someone who had died 3 years before he even moved in. Everything made sense now, the mechanical sounds, the items that never changed, the notes that disappeared without response, the presence he'd felt watching him, the cold spots in the apartment, the way his name had been called from the living room. Minho didn't pack. He didn't take anything except his wallet and phone. He ran from that apartment and never looked back. He spent his final semester sleeping on friends' couches, in the library, anywhere but apartment 4B. Later, he learned the full truth. Park Jisoo had been a student just like him, struggling with money and loneliness. They had died by suicide in that room during exam season, found days later by a concerned professor. The apartment had been cleaned and renovated, but no tenant had ever stayed longer than a few weeks. Minho graduated, got his job, and moved on with his life. But sometimes, on quiet nights when he's alone in his new apartment, he still hears those soft, mechanical footsteps. And sometimes, just sometimes, he wonders if Jisoo followed him. The building management eventually sealed apartment 4B permanently. They said it was due to structural issues, but the security guards knew better. They knew that some rooms are never truly empty, and some roommates never really leave. So the next time you're looking for the perfect housing situation, remember Minho's story. Sometimes the deal that seems too good to be true is exactly that, and sometimes the roommate you never see is the one you should fear the most.